I do not have a presentation for this. It was just what's in your tool bag, what tools should you guys have. I'll come up and do, I think Larry was here doing laundry. Is that right? Are you doing laundry here, Larry? Somebody's got some. Everybody got some clothes to hang? So I was just going to go through and some of the things that I've collected over the years, and you guys probably have the majority of this, so it's anything rocket science. I was going to go through some stuff in the bag. I remember when I was in junior high, there was a police officer that came to talk to us, and one of the kids was like, "Hey, what's on your tool belt?" And so we spent some time going through his tool belt. I'm like, "Oh, that's kind of cool." So, okay, what's in your bag? Let's go through that and see what we got. Mythbusters. You guys ever know Adam Savage? He's got this first order retrievability type of concept. So I don't have a big rolling cart when you're doing props and things in the yard. It's like everything needs to be kind of handy and close to where you need to grab stuff. So I've had this bag for years, and it's got the outside pockets because it's easy to grab stuff. It's going to have most of the common stuff that we're going to always go through and need. Needle nose pliers, regular wire snips, and then I've got two different types of wire strippers. And what I do is one's red handle, one's yellow handle. And I know when I put my things away, the red handled one always goes with the needle nose pliers, and the yellow handled one always goes with the snip. So if I want one of those two, I'll know that these two are the same looking thing, but I know this one goes with the red one, this one goes with the white one. So it's just weird memory things. This one is a little bit smaller, so it goes all the way down to 28 gauge wire. And if you know Cat 5, Cat 6, it's 24 gauge wire. So sometimes you ever have a weird need to strip any Cat 5 wire. Some people use it for power injection. I have used it for making custom cables where you use one of the 8 strands for data, use 3 for power, and you use 4 for ground. So I'll strip those and make them, and it works well. It hasn't failed on me. People drop on that. If the wire gets kinked, then you've overloaded your circuit. And there's a whole debate for that. We won't get into that. A pair of scissors, carpet knife. You're always using stuff. I've used this bag for so long that when I kept putting the scissors in there, this year it finally wore a hole in the pocket. So I'm like, oh no, I gotta get a new bag. And so I went to Lowe's and spent $100 on a new bag, and I started putting things in it. I'm like, this is horrible. It's not the same. So I had acrylic. It was like a fiberglass resin. I'm like, I already had that for another project, so I had fiberglass resin to the bottom of my bag. So they're hard now. We're not going through there. So the bag has been reinforced. So I've got Sharpies, and we were here the other night, and we're like, I need a Sharpie. Well, what color do you want? Because I've got red and blue and silver. Is always good to have silver if you're marking on black things, Coro. So I use the silver just as much as I do black because it shows up on different things. Ink pens, the carpenter pencil so it doesn't roll away. So that's some of the front stuff. Screwdrivers. What's that? I do, but then they can't see them. Now they're all way at the top. So yes, if I'll do the same thing. I'll Sharpie, make sure to point them down. Screwdrivers, dedicated screwdrivers. We deal with the little Phoenix connectors all the time. So I have a little flat one. I have a little Phillips one because you're always doing different types of connectors. I have a big, ugly red one, and that's used more for pry bars and beating up stuff and hammering stuff. So I don't use the long, flat things, but it's more of a chisel than anything else. And then obviously the double screwdriver that has the nut drivers and everything with it. So I use that all the time. I let somebody borrow it for a week, and I'm like, oh, I'm lost without this thing because I use it all the time. For my tools, I used to have these. They're just regular wire cutters. They work okay, but I don't find myself using them as much anymore. These things are handy, these little side cutter dikes. I use these all the time, probably just as much as anything else. You can obviously cut wire with these, but this is small. These are great for zip ties. If you don't have a zip tie gun, it's one of the noticeable things that's absent from my bag, but I use these all the time. I've ordered more. I've had them on my tool bench, workbench, soldering station. I use these my 3D printer when you're cutting that filament. So I find myself using these guys all the time just for cutting little zip ties and not nicking wires. The most recent thing I got, which you can laugh, this is a seam ripper. So I got to put in my home ec skills. I saw a tip where you take your wire and your sheath and you can seam rip the side to cut it. So it works for Romex, it works for any type of thing, but you can seam rip right at the top as opposed to taking your utility knife and cutting your finger and slicing it down that way. You seam rip and you just zip up the side. So I've used that and it's worked well. So keep that in mind for cheap, dumb little tools to put in your bag. I've got the 120 volt tester, so if you're ever doing higher voltage, 120 volt, make sure your power is not on and live. I think I have a mini lights to converter, a mini lights to pixel lights converter, which is just your step drill. So if you needed to cut your core out, the step drills are awesome. I love these for everything, drilling holes in any of your power boxes. They're great to put in PG cables, but this is the best way to drill through aluminum, through plastic, anything, instead of grabbing one size drill bit. I keep one of these in one of my drills all the time, but I've got different sizes, including a big fat one. I think I've gotten all these from Harbor Freight, but you'll need the bigger ones for some bigger PG glands or PVC, but I'll have different versions of step drill and it just goes through the plastic as opposed to doing a spade bit or Forstner bit. These are really, really handy. More 120 volt stuff. If you're redoing electrical outlets, this doubles as that, but I've got a little tester for this. Plugs into your electrical outlet while you're putting in wires, so not as much 12 volt Christmas light stuff, but it's handy for replacing electrical outlets because you can twist the outlet in and smash it, and so it doubles as a light and fuse, but it's also for handling your electrical outlets, and then your standard GFI tester as well. So a little bit more for electricity. I'm not an electrician, I'm not certified, I'm mechanical, so I'm a wannabe Sparky. I've got a makeshift wrench with a string on it. This is my plumb bob, so if I ever need anything plumb, hanging pictures or whatever, this is my adjustable wrench with a plumb bob string on it. Spade bit for anything random, and I think that's mostly it on the outside. I mentioned needles, pliers. I probably use these as much as anything else, and a different version of that. You can find these on swap meets all the time. I find myself using these quite often. Just hemostats. They're cheap, they're $1 or $2 from swap meets. I've got a curved pair and a straight pair. You're always needing to grab a little wire and tuck it in somewhere, so I find myself using those quite often. Zip ties. You can't have enough zip ties. You gotta have zip ties everywhere. Tip I learned a long time ago is if you have a zip tie bag, cut a slit in the middle, and therefore you can pull it out one at a time and they're not falling out of your bag. So split that in the middle and you're good to go. Different sizes, I think I use 11 inch, 8 inch. I also have the little bitty guys, the 4-inch zip ties. These come just as handy because this will, if you're ever redoing like a spiral tree, I redid all my spiral trees and took it from dumb to smart. And you don't need the big zip ties. Get the small ones, they hold just as much. You're not putting 90 pounds on them, so the small ones are every bit as good as anything else. You gotta have a multimeter. You gotta test continuity. You gotta be able to know if wires are connected or not. So you gotta have DC voltage and then AC voltage. So you gotta have one of these. You can't do lights without having a multimeter. So Les was going to use this, testing out how much power draws across there. We'll plug it into the connector and you can find out how much power draws comes in there. So you gotta have one of these. A couple other things on the inside. Nobody makes coax cables anymore. I did make a coax cable because it is your external antenna to your FM modulator. So I've got the FM modulator. You can take coax, and I've got that running from the inside of my house, my garage. I've got 50 feet of coax to the external. I've got a dipole antenna, so you can take your FM modulator, and the antenna can be outside, the modulator can be inside. So that has plenty of range doing that. Probably another skill you'd need to have is the ability to make Cat5 cables. They're expensive if you just want to keep buying Cat5 cables, but you need a 100-foot run, you need a 50-foot run, whatever it is. Having the ability to make custom link Cat5 cables, Ethernet cables, you're using them all the time for differentials, you're using them for network. A couple people have already mentioned was hardwire everything as opposed to not having wireless. So something's beeping in here at me. Got too many other electronics that are yelling at me. But spend a little time. There's tons of videos on YouTube making Cat5. I've got Cat5 back here. If you wanted to see how to make encrypt cables, we can do that. Cat5 cables is cheaper than Cat6. Cat6 is a little stiffer. The sheathing's a little bit bigger. It's newer standards. I don't think you can go to Lowe's or Home Depot and buy Cat5 cable. It's going to be all Cat6. It's got tighter twists on the wires, so sometimes it's easier to put ends on Cat5 cable, and for what we're doing, it's plenty fine. So I've got a crimper, and I've got the ends as well, so memorize your patterns for crimping cables, and this is the strips the outside of the Cat5, so you roll those around and do it. I've got a punch down tool for Cat5 cables if you're ever putting in the keystone jacks and terminals. I've got that, and then this is what yelling at me. Whenever you make a Cat5 cable, you gotta test it, because it's not perfect. Nobody's ever making perfect Cat5s, so, and Ethernet cables, so just test it. So you can do in and out, and therefore you can test one cable, or if you've got a long run, plug it one in one side, here's your remote, plug it in on the other side, therefore you've got all 8 wires are good. So I've got a little extra wires in case it's needing somewhere, but you gotta have a little tester. These are cheap, and it'll tell you if you've got all your pairs in the right direction. Some other specialty crimpers. Sometimes people use butt connectors for automotive stuff. I've got some butt connectors. We don't use these in our hobby that much. I've got some DuPont cables, connectors, and I've standardized, to keep everything simple, on 5-volt, I've got these more automotive style cables. And so they're 3-pin, you can get them in 2 and 4 and 6, but I use 3 because we have 3 for our hobby. This is all my 5-volt connections, so I can't mix and match. I won't be able to plug in this cable as that for this. And these take a different type of crimper, so this is specifically for these type of outputs. So that is what I use this crimper for. Les mentioned solder shrink tubes. There's a couple different sizes. We almost always use the little red style for pigtails or connections. 18 gauge wire is going to be red. I use blue for if I'm doing 18 gauge plus something else. So on the back of the wreath, when I did the power distribution, I had to use the blue ones, but get a variety of these. You'll go through a ton of these. If you want to see them, take a look at them. You're welcome to if you haven't seen those. I went to Harbor Freight, got a cheap little heat gun, nothing special, but then it's a DIY community, so I was making pizza and had leftover aluminum foil. Not really, but just put some wire around it. I put a curve on it because you can buy the name brand ones. It's been $40 on an extra attachment, but I just put a little curve on it. So when I'm doing a solder shrink, I can put the wire in there, and then I can be close to a prop. I can be close to other cables, and I can deflect the heat, and so it stays within there, and I'm not melting Coro, I'm not heating up other pixels, and so it kind of deflects the wire, deflects the heat a little bit more. It's easier to hold too on your hand because I usually use gloves, but if you're holding it, it's hard to get those wires in the right direction. So I've got two, one with this and one without, just because they're inexpensive. But figuring out how to do that, there's newer things in the market. Click-Its, who was the Click-It winner? I think, Joel, you might have been the Click-It winner for the giveaways. I think Experience Lights has those. So there's other ways to join cables. I don't think anybody's using solder and soldering gun anymore. I think the market's going away from that. Nobody wants to be out in the rain soldering things on a ladder. So the heat shrink's a good way to go. Nothing else too exciting. I've got electrical tape in different colors in case you ever need to code anything. I probably use this more in like my telco rack. So I've got one power cord, which is one cord going into a PoE switch, and so I know where it's connected on the front and the back. I can quickly see the labels on my cords. This one's got a blue tape on it, this one's got a yellow tape, so I can see the front and the back of those, so I can quickly unplug and plug things. Gotta have electrical tape. I have some other things, tape measures, stud finders, nothing crazy. I use these a lot too. These are the little pads for zip ties. If you're mounting something, you can stick these on, and then your zip tie cable will go through there, and then you can wire around it. So these come in handy sometimes if you're putting wires inside a control box and you want to have a little bit more tidy. You can use these guys. I haven't had a lot of luck. Some people swear by these styles. There's pistol styles of crimpers where we'll take the wire, grab it, and strip and crimp multiple at a time. Maybe this is a generic version. I should spend more money on Irwin or something like that, but I find myself just trusting the single wire at a time. Strippers, each their own. I'm not going to argue on process, but this is when I was digging up my bag and cleaning it out last night. I'm like, oh, that was in there, but it's at the bottom because I never used it. So I'll switch gears to a couple other things from like benchtop power supplies and testing things. Whenever you're setting up controllers, you'll need power to supply because you're not, maybe you already buy a box already pre-built, but if not, you've got to plug in a controller and go, and you're needing to get 12 volt power, you're needing to get 5 volt power. This is a monstrosity, this is an old one, I've kind of replaced it, but for a while I was buying server power supplies. This is a 1U, this one is the biggest one I have. It's got too many amps that you need, but I will just take the wires, and if you're not familiar, yellow is 12 volt, red is 5 volt, all blocks common ground, so you can pull those anywhere you want. So these are going to be your typical regular Molex connectors from inside a PC, and so I'll use these anywhere. I think I've got this one just as an adapter, so I can go and quickly plug in a 12 volt and a ground, and I can plug it into a controller, fire it up, get the OS on there, and now it's ready to be moved out into the show. The only thing with these is this is the ATX header, which is typically plugged into your motherboard. I would buy adapter extension cables and cut those off for a couple reasons. One, there's a green wire, there's only one green wire, and then it's got to be grounded. And so if the power supply does not sense a complete loop on the green wire being grounded, it won't turn on. So a lot of people will use a paperclip trick and they'll plug it in just to ground the green wire back to the ground. But what I find useful is I take that green wire and I take the ground wire and I put a switch on the end of it. So now I've got control over a power supply with just a little bitty switch, and therefore I'm not yanking the cord off of it, because whenever you yank a cord, then you're like, ah, and everything goes every which way. So I've used that same concept on most of my builds. So even like a differential box where there's a HP power supply, I've got one little switch in here, right there, and so then that kills the power. So if I ever need to reset something, I find that like stars or something, whatever this is plugged into, maybe there's a pixel that's stuck on and you just need a quick little reset of your power supply instead of yanking on your C13 cord and pulling that out and totally killing the power. It's just as easy to do a little switch on that. So ATX power supplies, you can do that with, and then on this one I've got 12 volts, so I've got a little 12 volt barrel adapter. So this one has kind of been a monstrosity of adapters and ways that I can do positive and negative on things. I more recently took a different ATX power supply, and this is what you would normally find in a PC, in the back of the PC, with a fan that blows out, painted blue so it doesn't look as bad. But all the cables came out and were hanging just like this was. So I took them all and I made them 12 volt, 12 volt, 5 volt. So I've got rails on 12 and 5 volt, and then I also have an adapter as well. So I can modify the voltage. So this blue, positive and negative, is actually modified. So I can take it down to 12, I can go up to 5, I can go to 7 volts or whatever you need. So I've got it on magnets, big fan of magnets on controllers or almost anything. So on my workbench, I've got pegboard, they're all magnetic pegboards, and my testing bench, I've got metal pegboards, so my controller boxes, they'll have metal in them, so I can easily grab any controllers and they'll stick in there. I can grab them and go, they're not screwed down, so they're easily flexible to wherever I want them. So this guy's got magnets on the back, so I can just slap them anywhere and plug them in and go. I only got a few minutes left on, we were talking about power supplies, HP power supplies. There is the real expensive ones that are light blue and they have a ton of wattage and amps for 12 volt. These are only 12 volts. If you switch to the other kind with the pigtails, you can also get 5 volts out of these. So like it was mentioned, some of my controllers, I've got 5 volts to power a couple large reefs with this style, and I've got 12 volts. So I've got 12 volts and 5 volts in a box with one power supply, so it saves time. Is there a debate which one's better? Yes, but I use both in one power supply. It doesn't take up any more room. On these guys, you will want to, you're welcome to come up later, but there's 2 pins. The first one and the fourth one are what will turn those on and off. So it's the same sensing power, so all solder wires on there, and plug those into a switch, and you can do the same thing. So you can buy adapters. I've got adapters other places. There's a ton of places that will sell the adapters, little slips, get on there for you, and you can have the terminals. You can solder them on and drill right through these lugs, solder your own things, so you can do that. I was buying a lot of orange. It's a little bit higher amps. These are, I think these are rated for 220 volts, so just make sure they're different ratings for 120 volt. But if you're not plugging a lot of pixels into them, these are substantially cheaper. The blue ones, they're much less amps. You can get these for $6-7 a piece compared to Meanwell. I don't say anything bad about Meanwell. I don't own any. Maybe I'm too cheap to buy $30 power supplies when these are $7, and they have just as much amperage as a Meanwell. These are HPE servers. They're rated to be in a data center to run all the time, so I don't have any issues with failures on those. The last thing we'll talk about is, because of what I have left, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, more of a show and tell item, but there was somebody on Official X Lights that did a pixel tester, and so I kind of took some of that design and I modified it. Maybe Tim the Toolman tailored it, added a lot more things to it. So I've got 120 volts coming in, so you can run it from hardwire. And then I also have a battery on the side, so I can run it from a DeWalt battery. So I can turn it on, and then I've got 12 volts. I got different buck converters on there, and this is what I was powering the Christmas tree previously on. But I've got 12 volts, so I've got to take it from 20 volts or 18 volts out of your batteries, 12 volts, and at least knock it down to 12 volts. I also have a switch in here that I can switch and modify to 5 volts. So I can run 12 volts or 5 volts, and that shows, so whatever I want to do, I can test both 5 volts and 12 volt pixels out of there. Just be careful when you're putting them in, that you're not plugging the wrong lights. You've got a flashlight, so anybody was asleep in the front row, you're always looking for a flashlight. And then, so both the 12 volt and a 5 volt buck converter, 120 volt to 12 volt DC, and then the cheap little pixel tester I just taped on the front, so you can make sure your lights are all working to whatever you need. So you're welcome to come up and take a look at that. I think after I was close to getting done building this, then Dock Controller came out with their cooler test thing that tests differentials. I'm like, oh, I'll just throw this in the trash now. It's useless. So, but no, there's that one's really cool. So Leslie and I were playing around with that last night. But we'll call it. We'll move into show and tell as needed, and you can ask questions or look at anything else up here. And thank you guys for your time. Appreciate it.
I second the motion on the seam ripper. You solder like I do, you find that every now and then you get a bad solder after you've already put the heat shrink on it. And a seam ripper is great for ripping that heat shrink off, not tearing up the wire.